This is episode 114 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week, we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, we've got several important items this week, starting out with most notably a meeting and some discussion around PNM and the Energy Transition Act that is going to result in the shutdown of the San Juan generating station. They started their, dog and pony show would be the way I would put it, with a meeting at the Albuquerque Museum, the art museum here in Albuquerque near Old Town this week. And Rio Grande Foundation was in attendance, taking notes, collecting all the information that unfortunately is not available on their website, because that would just be too much information for the public to handle. Wally, I know you have certainly followed the PNM and the Energy Transition Act very closely. We've talked about this meeting and its results. Give me your first impressions here of where things stand with PNM as they start to roll out their proposals under the Energy Transition Act.
Yeah, they presented four alternatives, and it reminds me a little bit of marketing theory when you have different packages that are designed to point you to one in particular. So, and I don't know if they came clean on that at the meeting, but they have a wide range of options, but I don't think it's a coincidence that option one is the option they want to pick. So option 2, 3, and 4 are pretty much throwaways, although option 2 actually could work. I don't think 3 and 4 would work. And at their own admission, likely blackouts. I mean, that's not a good term. That's not a good plan going forward.
No doubt about it. So just to give folks a little backdrop here, you can find this information at errorsoфenchantment.com. It is what it is, which is not a well scanned in perfect document. This is a paper that I was handed at the PNM meeting, and it is headlined, "PNM is closing the San Juan coal plant, so what's next?" Snapped a picture of this thing. It really, by all accounts, should be available online, but it provides an explanation of what PNM is looking at in terms of four options that will be pursued through the various public entities, and PNM plans to move forward with a basic mix of natural gas, solar, battery, which obviously batteries do not by themselves generate power, but they would be required for consistent electricity generation with heavy solar and wind. And then, of course, wind is a part of this. And there's four different solutions or program scenarios. 3 and 4 are heavy on renewables. And basically, PNM is saying that the grid will not sustain those high levels of renewables, wind and solar. It is really 1 and 2, which are realistic according to PNM. And I think that's fair to say that these two are the main realistic programs, if you will, that PNM is looking at. 1 is, as Wally astutely points out, recommended. It is the desired proposal of PNM. 2 is a more San Juan County centric plan. Of course, San Juan County is going to be most dramatically hit by the Energy Transition Act and the shutdown of the coal-fired power plant. So let's run through these real quick here. Under recommended scenario 1, 280 megawatts of gas. Under that plan as well, 350 megawatts of solar, 130 megawatts of battery, 140 megawatts of wind, which a little footnote, they say, well, that's already in process. So just taking out the wind, 630 megawatts total, Wally. And for those who were at the presentation or maybe are aware, The estimated capacity of the coal-fired power plant is about 476 megawatts, thereabouts, so 475. Wally, why would we have natural gas and solar combining for 630 to replace a 475 megawatt power plant?
Because megawatts are not megawatt hours. And before you fall asleep listening to the Tipping Point New Mexico podcast, that is a fancy way of saying that a megawatt is what's called the nameplate capacity. What can that particular facility produce in the way of energy when it's running? Megawatt hours are power. It's energy over time. And not too surprisingly, solar doesn't work at night. So you need something else to work while solar's not working. And so the total megawatts you get have to be a lot higher when you have renewables, because by their very nature, they're intermittent. Now, a coal plant or a natural gas plant will need to go down for maintenance. And so you have to have ways to work through that cycle. But on a day-to-day basis, they tend to be available when they are in operating condition, 24/7. So it's a way different ballgame when you have renewables. So that's why you have to have a lot more of them in the mix if that's what you're going to use.
And that's even with 130 megawatts of batteries, that you still have that additional amount required. So 280 megawatts of gas, that is going to be pretty much always on. And notably, you look at scenario 2, which is more San Juan focused, and it kind of, scenario 2, the San Juan focused one, relies on exclusively natural gas as that bridge fuel. There's no additional solar, no batteries. The wind is 140 megawatts that they've already got in the pipeline, so to speak. So essentially, what you're talking about is in 2040, PNM has said that they will voluntarily go zero carbon. The astute observers and listeners to this show will note that natural gas is a carbon-based fuel source. Now, we at the Rio Grande Foundation would say that natural gas, it's about half the carbon emissions of coal. If you're going to set yourself up for closing the San Juan generating station, which we do not agree with, but if you are moving to natural gas as a pretty much exclusive electricity provider, given natural gas prices, given that San Juan County is a major producer of said fuel source, that seems like something that long-term would be a good option. And then maybe you can filter in some renewables as they become more efficient, more viable, and you can run the renewables when they are there, leave the natural gas plants or more of them for running when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Not worrying so much about these deadlines of 50% and in 2030 and shut down all carbon emissions by 2040.
Well, let me start with the first point is to get to zero carbon, we're going to invest in new carbon. So that's a little bit ironic, if nothing else. And then the other issue is just how these renewable fuel standards have turned the electric generation industry with regard to regulated utilities on its head. Because you need a lot of peaking power and intermittent power in the form of gas or something else, because wind and solar are so unreliable. And one of the calculations that I saw at one point, and whether this calculation holds true to the penny, but a lot of the gas-fired power plants that are being built, because they're not designed to run all the time, are single phase, not combined cycle, which use some recovery of the heat from the initial burning of the gas and create another unit. Those combined cycle units are a lot more expensive than the single cycle ones. But you only want to build those if you're going to run it 24/7. Well, you don't want to run it 24/7. You can't with renewable fuel standards. When the sun is shining and the wind is blowing, you have to use that wind and solar energy first. And one of the ironies is there have been calculations in certain utilities that you actually emit less carbon dioxide if you have a mix of natural gas and wind and solar, by having no wind and solar, because you can build these more efficient gas-fired plants and just ignore the wind and solar. So these are the sorts of things. This is the kind of issue that's very complicated. It's not addressed in these issues. And, we're going to have wind and we're going to have solar. Those are given. And then we're going to configure the rest of the system to figure out what happens from there.
There's so many... We'll just call the show Utility Talk New Mexico, because there's so much that we can talk about here. First and foremost, Wally, I think your comments are very pertinent. One of the people there from PNM described the gas-fired power plant as being like a jet engine. He called it the equivalent of a jet engine with the natural gas.
And you can ramp it up real quickly if you need the power, and you can ramp it down
and that's
real
the
quickly.
Single cycle?
Single, yes.
Okay. Well, that comes into play in the further discussion, but I want to note first and foremost that PNM does for each scenario list four different CO2 kind of figures in terms of how much or little CO2 will be released. This is dating back, so they're using 2005 Paris Accord numbers as the benchmark, just to screw everybody up and make it even more complicated. Because I think they've had consultants over the years looking at, and the Paris Accord goes back to 2005 carbon emissions and how much below that you would be.
And just in PNM's case, that meant all 4 units of San Juan generating station were running back then. So you're going to get a huge reduction. Even if they did nothing, because they've already turned off 2 units of San Juan generating station.
Hey, just because you're starting the race halfway through the 100 meters, it's okay. But it's worth noting to that effect that, so the first scenario, the PNM recommended is 62% reduction. The second, which is basically replacing the coal-fired power plant with natural gas, 59%. So you're basically achieving comparable returns just by replacing the coal-fired plant with exclusively natural gas. And then the 2 renewable-only scenarios, 65 and 67%. So those are more CO2 reducing, but doing natural gas only, and I question the financials of this whole thing. And one of the things it's worth noting is that because of that 2040 carbon-free deadline, PNM is talking about depreciating or amortizing these natural gas facilities over 18 years, not 30 years, which you're taking a facility that could operate for 30 years and accelerating that. So that means you have a lot less time to make that cost look good for the natural gas facilities. You're not experiencing that for the wind and the solar, et cetera.
Well, and that is based on a set of assumptions that you have to really buy into a lot of assumptions over a long period of time. I used to work with physicists, and one time, whenever your assumptions get the better of you, they used to tell me, assume a spherical chicken. And that was just saying that there's so many assumptions out there. Okay, one of the assumptions is that this plan actually can go forward. We have battery power in there, which is huge. So are those batteries going to work? The history to this point, from a cost and reliability point of view, has been very, very shaky. They have cost numbers. Have utilities ever estimated incorrectly the cost of a new form of energy, nuclear power plants, in terms of their history going forward? And the answer is absolutely yes. So this all works on the magical spreadsheet. But, spreadsheets, for those of you who have done any financial analysis, have assumptions, and there are a lot of assumptions on this. And one of them, which is that this thing will work perfectly, the cost will be exactly how they say, that it'll be highly reliable. And I do think that battery thing, if you're to look at what one of the weak links of these plans are right now, batteries are looking mighty shaky. We're always 36 months from a new technology, but it's been that way for really, 30 years. That's one of the issues. And then are these costs, can they hold to these costs? Are we going to see rapid rises in electric rates like we've seen in California. And PNM goes as far as to say, this is not the California plan. Well, it looks a lot like the California plan to me, but we'll have to see as things go forward, can they really keep to these costs? And then the final thing is their costs. They always talk about this will be lower costs. There will be savings. But what goes unsaid in those discussions is savings relative to their otherwise projections of having San Juan generating station in place over the next 20 years. They don't say that. Mm-hmm. So they could very possibly in the future say, of course, there's going to be a rate increase. We never said there wasn't going to be a rate increase. We said the cost was going to be lower, parenthetically, than it would have been otherwise. Then it would have been otherwise is one of those huge assumptions that's not been disclosed nearly to the level that I think the public will come to expect in the coming months.
Well, Wally,
and
we're going
years.
to come back to the cost issue. You're too smart, too ahead of the curve here. There's things we need to talk about. Actually, I was just sitting here looking at scenario number 2. This is the San Juan centric situation where you got 140 megawatts of wind coming online, 476 megawatts of natural gas. Now, we have a 50% renewable mandate kicking in by 2030. Natural gas is not considered renewable. Where are the renewables to get to 50% if you're replacing a coal-fired plant with essentially 100% natural gas? I'm not even sure if the logic of that holds up. That's one issue that I wanted to throw out there. And again, folks, errorsofenchantment.com. We have a detailed breakdown of this. The posting is titled PNM Stakeholder Meeting, or How PNM Plans to Implement New Mexico's Green New Deal, dated July 19th. I fully expect this document to really set the basis for a lot of talking points and discussion throughout 2019 and beyond. Now, in terms of the cost, there are costs that they line up here, and we're going to kind of ignore the all renewable things that they line out there. Basically, those cost even more, according to PNM, despite the fact that they say that wind and solar are cheaper than traditional sources of electricity at this point. But the baseline preferred option, and I love the way they put this number together, is 4,678 million. So for the mathematically disinclined, this is $4.678 billion.
Yes.
Now, at the meeting, I specifically asked a question of PNM's guys. They had a panel of folks up there, a lovely spread of veggies and all kinds of food. They were giving away PNM logo iced cookies that my wife says cost $3 to $4 a piece because they're essentially hand iced. Anyway, they clearly spared no expense for this, but they are saying that this plan will cost $7 billion over the next 20 years. And when I asked my question, I said, well, where is that savings coming from? How are we getting to saving money? Because they also said that in the first year, average utility payers' rates will go down, their bills will go down by $7.11. I was told at this meeting that because of fuel costs, savings, et cetera, that they would save $30 million annually by shutting down San Juan generating station. So I'm no math wizard, but I took $4.678 billion, divided it by 20 years, and you get about $230 million a year. So subtract that $30 million in fuel savings from the San Juan generating station, you still get $200 million above current costs annually by PNM's own admission.
But it would have been higher otherwise. I'm telling you, that is the game. That is the game that's afoot from everything I've seen.
Higher than what?
So their integrated resource plan had this projection of what they thought San Juan generating station was going to cost over the planning horizon. And they had things in there like Obama era coal regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So, they show an ever increasing amount of coal. So they're saying cheaper than what it would have been going up in the future, not cheaper than it is today. It's a lot like when the federal government when we have a government program that increases by less than it used to increase, we call that a cut, even though it's higher. It's a similar concept that's out there. And it's like the phrase compared to what it should have been. Anytime you hear any of these thoughts, I think that thought ought to come into our listeners' mind, because that's huge relative to these calculations. And if I could, one other factor that you brought up very, very appropriately is they do say that wind and solar are the lowest cost.
Right.
Why? It's not, because all wind and solar have the highest cost in this, because you need so much of it. So it's one of those things there. It's like this complicated algebraic formula in your hardest algebra you ever took. And we only talk about a very small part of it. We don't see the whole picture.
Well, this is a very auspicious time to relay a message I received from the Competitive Enterprise Institute this week. Rio Grande Foundation was one of numerous nonprofit organizations, including Competitive Enterprise Institute, CEI.org, if you want to check them out. The email says, "I'm pleased to announce that with the release of the Trump administration's Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which rescinded the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan, it is now time to declare victory on our challenge to the Clean Power Plan. We plan to join a joint motion," I love legal speak, "with our fellow petitioners from the states and industry asking the D.C. Circuit Court to dismiss the Clean Power Plan litigation as moot." So please let me know if you have any objections, and congratulations on this favorable outcome. So essentially, the Clean Power Plan that PNM had used as its default moving forward for coal-fired power plants, that Obama-era rule has been abandoned. Trump has a different thing moving forward. So our legal action with these other groups has been essentially, we've pulled back on that. We've said, we're going to abandon that lawsuit because it's a moot point. It's irrelevant at this point. So anyway, Wally, it just seems that PNM is trying to make lemonade out of lemons here. Very, very hard. They don't have the ingredients at their fingers. The numbers don't add up. It is going to be a lot of money coming out of somebody's pockets, whether taxpayers from the state of New Mexico or ratepayers, or probably both,
or shareholders of PNM, to the extent that they're forced to invest money and don't get the recovery that they think they should.
Yeah, the whole idea of investing in natural gas power plants with a lifetime usability of 30 years and then decommissioning them after 18 years to adhere to this arbitrary rule seems to be rather wasteful. It's easy to talk about carbon emissions as the only form of pollution or potential environmental problem that this world has ever seen. But on my family's trip back east and across the Great Plains, going through Amarillo and Oklahoma, where there are a lot of windmills, you see these trucks, big semi, tractor trailer, non-electrical trucks carrying one wind turbine blade across the prairie. And you've seen them probably going through town here. I don't know from whence they come, and I don't know where they're going exactly, but they're going to be set up. The amount of carbon emissions and the amount of resources that you have to go get to mine to put into these windmills and solar panels is substantial. And those costs, I'm sure, are not included in any way, shape, or form in PNM's numbers with regard to carbon emissions. Certainly the truck rolling across the freeway, et cetera, the trucks, I should say, because you got to have many, many trucks, not just to assemble these wind turbines, but also to maintain them and keep them in good running order. There's a lot of resources being invested, carbon emissions and fuels that are pulled out of the ground. I can't see how those are inputted into these models.
Yeah, and then the other point, I am with you, Paul. The other point I want to make about this, and hey, I did find it on PNM's site.
Find what?
The chart.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Well, that's new because I was looking on there.
So,
last week.
PNM.com/powering the future. So it's there. And then what's interesting is it redirects you to PNM.com powering the future. But I was able to do that. So maybe they've kind of cross-referenced some of their web addresses. So I was able to get that to come up. But to the best of my ability to understand this chart and the costs, Paul, none of these numbers include the securitized payments that they get for the quote unquote stranded costs of San Juan Generating Station. That's handled elsewhere. And so to add further confusion, it's one of those, there are lots of buckets of costs and there's lots of variables going into this, and it's very difficult to see the overall issue. But PNM on their website this last fall did have that they expected there to be rate increases as a result of this plan, because again, they talk about lower costs relative to what it would have been. So better than what it would have been.
No doubt about it. And one last item on this. I know for those of you who hate utilities and that discussion, stick with us here. This is a big issue. There was a story in the Albuquerque Journal, legal battle brewing over San Juan Power Station closure this Sunday, July 21st, Kevin Robinson Avila. And now it looks like the PRC, Public Regulation Commission, is not going quietly into that good night. And without getting into too many details, the PRC is a separate elected body from our legislature. It has a lot to say legally about utility regulation, insurance regulation, a lot of these things. So when the Energy Transition Act passed, the PRC was in many ways left out in the cold. Their powers in terms of how PNM would be regulated and what electricity sources they would be required to use were put aside, so to speak. And Wally, you know more about the PRC, quite frankly, than I do. Walk us through as we kind of conclude this robust discussion of the Energy Transition Act, what the PRC is concerned about and what issues are arising here.
Yeah, it seems to me from, I read that article and what I've seen as well is that the PRC's taking the position that there was an abandonment docket, and abandonment's the fancy utility word for if you're going to shut down and not use a power plant anymore, you need a filing with the Public Regulatory Commission, that was in play before the Energy Transition Act passed. And since that's the case, that the Energy Transition Act in whole or in part may not apply to PNM's getting out of the San Juan Generating Station. So there's a lot of legal wrangling. There's many who are not pleased with the legislature basically taking this huge policy issue and forcing this very narrow interpretation of what should happen with regard to San Juan. And then I've heard almost laughably, oh, this isn't just for San Juan Generating Station. Well, it doesn't apply to any other power plant in New Mexico. So yes, absolutely. It's about San Juan Generating Station, the securitization. If you happen to have another 2-unit coal-fired power plant that met all the requirements, you could apply this law. There just aren't any that are like that. So these issues are swirling around, and then there's a movement afoot politically to move from an elected to an appointed commission. If you're a newly elected commissioner, I don't think that's making you really too warm and fuzzy and happy about your role in life. And so there are a lot of both legal, political, and practical elements of uncertainty that's come about since the Energy Transition Act has passed. And that's another example. And we've also already seen that the PRC did not go along with PNM's and the state of New Mexico's stated position on what the power agreement was going to be with Facebook south of Albuquerque. So we're seeing them assert some independence, sometimes in ways that are not popular with those that really recently passed legislation in Santa Fe or made deals. And I think it may take a while, and it's even come out in the media. If this gets to be a huge legal battle, it could take years to unravel.
Yeah. And, kind of, again, getting beyond this conversation, I know we've spent a lot of time on it. Rio Grande Foundation is generally sympathetic to the idea that the PRC should be nominated or put under the purview of the governor, just like we agreed with Bill Richardson, then governor, that the education secretary should be appointed by the governor and not under the purview of an elected multi-district body, the PEC at the time, which still exists mostly for chartering and tracking charter schools. And this PRC is by no means sympathetic to the Rio Grande Foundation's viewpoint that customers and businesses should regulate electrical power sources, not government bodies. The PRC is, however, exerting some influence through its institutional pull there that they have. Finally, we will officially lead the discussion by noting that PNM, on Twitter, you can follow them at PNM Talk. That is, you can follow them. The Rio Grande Foundation can still follow them, but the account at PGuessing, which I'll give you one guess as to who that is blocked from following at PNM Talk currently, which is a notable development because I believe recently President Trump was rebuked by a federal judge for blocking people on his Twitter account. I don't know what the legal ramifications might be, but a little bit surprising that PNM, given the disagreements that we've certainly had with them, but many other organizations in New Mexico, Rio Grande Foundation is tangled with and had some, we've had some choice words back and forth online. For PNM to block me personally, a little bit sad, but kind of makes me think that they don't necessarily concur with our messaging and that they want to go ahead and get their subsidy checks or whatever checks they're going to get and leave us in the dust. But interesting stuff there.
Oh, I'm sure it was just a clerical oversight or a clerical error, Paul. I'm sure that no one came in and said, we're going to silence Paul Gessig. Irony intended.
All right. Well, that was quite a discussion, as certainly befits what is going on with this Energy Transition Act. An article had run in the Albuquerque Journal by a UNM professor, the chairman of the UNM economics department. Who knew they even had such a thing? Sorry. It was called Study, Taxpayer Contributions to UNM Declined Over the Last Decade. And basically, the study, it is available online. Again, you can go to Errors of Enchantment to read it for yourself. It is a link, but it was done by a gentleman named Robert Behrens, Berrens, the UNM chairman of economics. Maybe a potential guest for this particular, the interview component of this show, showing it. State appropriations have gone down for UNM relative to tuition. But if you, and that is all well and true, but if you go on third-party sites like, the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, you can find a 2018 story showing that net tuition as a percentage of total educational revenue, New Mexico has the third lowest tuition of any state in the country. Wyoming and California, interestingly enough, two very culturally different states politically as well, have the lowest. Vermont, on the other hand, is head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of the most expensive, or tuition as being the highest of any state in the country. But New Hampshire's right next to them, literally and figuratively. New Hampshire's the second highest. And when you go to this 2018 report, educational appropriations per full-time student, we are the fifth highest state in the country after, again, Wyoming, Alaska, Illinois, Hawaii, and then there's New Mexico. So the fact that New Mexico has seen a drop in higher education spending over the last decade is simply indicative that we were extremely generous in our higher education spending, and we've gotten somewhat less so, but by no means is this or should this be taken by policymakers as a rallying cry for more education, more higher education spending. I would say that New Mexico has a ways to go in streamlining its higher ed situation, notably reducing the number of branch campuses would be an obvious choice. Wally, you've been around. You certainly got your start at a New Mexico higher education establishment.
At least as I consider it. Sometimes I get teased that others, not everyone assumes, but no, I went to New Mexico State, so.
Hey, on ESPN, they all think they're just the same.
Exactly. New Mexico
And quite frankly, when you're talking about the time when people start paying attention to this stuff in March, as the NCAA tournament kicks off, the Aggies have had more than their share of success and more of that success than their neighbors up to the north, the Lobos. But this is not meant to attack or besmirch the reputation of either institution, just to say that they have quite a bit of money from the taxpayers of the state of New Mexico.
Yeah, and then you said something very interesting, that it's relative to tuition, which is relatively small amount of total university spending. And one of the things that I just have this sense in New Mexico, but it's also, I believe, a nationwide phenomenon, is the cost and the capacity, meaning how many students they could educate and how costly that is. Those are both become very out of whack in America. Now, there are places that people will lie, steal, and cheat to get into the Harvard, Yales, and Stanfords of the world. But when it comes to, the middle America kind of universities, there's this kind of structural issue. How valuable is a certain degree? Is it worth these students having student loans? Is it worth all the government spending? Is it worth all the state spending, the lottery scholarship? What is the value there? And then in New Mexico, because the state as a whole has not grown and enrollment's a big issue at all universities in New Mexico over the past several years, it reminds me of in the 70s, the era of corporate downsizing, where, all these corporations had too much capacity. Technology was coming and they didn't need nearly as many employees. They didn't need to be as big from a numbers point of view. I think that is a huge background issue that these sort of studies. So yeah, you can argue this percentage is higher, that percentage is lower, but there's this fundamental issue with education that I think I bet this study didn't read it. I've been skimming it. It's 112 pages, so it's certainly thorough. But there is this question of not only the branch campuses around New Mexico, all the four-year institutions, but also we have this huge, our UNM and New Mexico State set up to handle more students than they're likely to be able to attract in the future because of these kind of strategic issues that haven't been looked at. And look at tuition over the past 20 years, what that's done across the country and cost of higher education. It costs money to have those big buildings at all these campuses, whether it's South Bend, Indiana, whether it's in Northern California or Las Cruces or Albuquerque.
No doubt about it. And, there's a gentleman who is an economist nationally, kind of a libertarian bent, Brian Kaplan, and he wrote a devastating book and a series of articles that essentially higher education spending is a boondoggle for state government, saying, look, if you're looking at this through the interest of a state, you should cut your higher education spending as much as possible because it doesn't benefit the overall economy of your state. It benefits the people who pursue the education to the extent that they succeed academically and actually get through the process. But he would argue, and I think very capably argue, that there's no real reason for the higher education bureaucracy to exist from a state's perspective. The whole idea of, well, you need all this research, you need all these prepared people. Well, you can do the research in a different context, and you can prepare your students, or they can prepare themselves through a very market-driven process of these institutions, not having a bureaucracy set up through the state to actually operate and manage educational outcomes. We're running short a little bit, but it is worth noting that Representative Xochitl Torres Small voted against raising the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. I think that needs to be recognized. Whether it is Xochitl Torres Small as a freshman in a relatively conservative area, being able to have some flexibility there on an issue that, quite frankly, the National Democratic Party knew was not going to pass through the Senate and become law. And I wonder how many of those Democrats would have voted for a $15 minimum wage had this actually been likely to pass through the Senate and be signed by the president. $15 an hour is more than double the current national minimum wage, which is $7.25 an hour. Of course, New Mexico is going to $12 an hour. It's worth noting that Representative Ben Ray Lujan, who's being challenged from the left, believe it or not, by Maggie Toulouse Oliver for a Senate seat, and Deb Haaland, of course, very, very stridently left-wing here, CD1. They both supported the $15 an hour minimum wage. And but Xochitl Torres Small said, I've heard a lot from people in my district in places like Roswell and Santa Rosa about the bill. We have to be able to help small businesses keep their doors open so they can pay their employees well. And boy, it's hard to disagree with anything that she said in that. And I do question whether she'll take that kind of stance, say, after redistricting, if she maintains the seat. But good for her. Credit where credit is due.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up an important point, likely not to become law anytime soon. The Senate leadership has said they would never bring such a bill to the floor of the Senate for a vote. So possibly symbolic, but I think it's a very well-reasoned. I think it's the right thing to do for a lot of reasons. I think a $15 minimum wage nationwide would be a form of the Rural Impoverishment and Depopulation Act. There's rural places now in New Mexico, the rural places that don't have oil and gas struggle as it is with jobs and economic activity and keeping things going. And to force something like this on the Ratones and Tucumcaris and Silver Cities of the world, I don't think would be a very big positive. In fact, to be a great negative. And yeah, hats off to her for taking a stand on that. And we will also see what's going to happen with the $12 minimum wage that the state has passed. Now, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and Cruces have already taken much higher wages into the marketplace over the past several years. And guess what? All those places aren't growing very quickly economically, but larger cities can absorb more bad policies like that, at least at some level. We'll see what that $12 will do in New Mexico. And so this could turn out, if things turn, to be a very shrewd political move, but I do think it's very solid from a policy economic point of view, and hats off to her.
Exactly. Rio Grande Foundation's on the road again soon. I'll be speaking up in Farmington at the Three Rivers Brew Distillery Lounge, July 31st, from 5 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. I believe that's a Wednesday. You can register online, riograndefoundation.org. Give us a call, 505-264-6090. This is a free event. Appetizers will be provided, but certainly designed to also expose the Rio Grande Foundation in a friendly but community we don't always get to up there in Farmington, and one that has more than its share of supporters, and hopefully we can get some more folks to support RGF's mission at this particular event. So if you're in that area, come on by 5 to 6:30 p.m. July 31st at the Three Rivers Brewstillery Lounge. And with that, thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for production of this show.